Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to our panel. I'm Alice Callahan. I'm a nutrition reporter at the New York Times. And we are here this morning to talk about the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. In January, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. rolled out the latest edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. To a lot of fanfare, he billed them as the most significant reset of federal nutrition policy in decades. And he's really touted these guidelines as a major MAHA win for the administration. And of course, as reporters, it's our job to watch Secretary Kennedy and see how his actions align with the science. These guidelines are very important as the foundation for federal food policy. And so today we're going to look at how these guidelines came to be, where they align with science and where they don't, and what we as reporters should be watching for in the future in terms of how they affect federal food policy. So I'll start by introducing our panelists. Today we have Dr. Joanne Slavin is here from the University of Minnesota. She's a professor of food science and nutrition. And she was a member of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, so these guidelines are updated every 5 years. And she served on this committee that reviewed the science and made recommendations for that edition of the guidelines. So she brings a wealth of experience and expertise in the field to our panel today. And then we also have Grace Chamberlin, who's a senior policy associate at the Center for Science and the Public Interest. CSPI is a nonprofit watchdog organization, and they have a long history of monitoring the guidelines. And Grace was the point person watching this edition of the guidelines develop and be unveiled. And then I will wrap up our talks with a few comments on covering the guidelines, and then we'll get to Q&A. So Dr. Slavin, you're up first. You can kick us off.
Well, I first want to welcome everybody to Minnesota. And when people say Minnesota is cold, you can say, actually, Minnesota is hot. So, so everywhere you go when you're from Minnesota, it's like, it's really cold up there. It is cold up here, but it's also really nice in the summer. So you guys have gotten the perfect time to come to Minnesota, enjoy our lakes and everything that's here. So welcome. So you've already heard a little bit about my background. I'll give you a little more and it's really history and personal reflections. So here's my affiliations. I am a professor in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences at the University of Minnesota, also called the Ag Campus, also right next to the State Fair. So people really only care about us when they walk through us to see the State Fair and say, hey, that's pretty cool. So. I also belong to some scientific societies that I want to make sure you know: Institute of Food Technologists, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and the American Society for Nutrition. I am a badger first before I became a gopher, but I can burrow anywhere and I feel comfortable wearing maroon or red. So depending on where I go, I try to dress for the occasion. But I have an undergraduate degree in dietetics and then a master's and PhD in nutritional sciences from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And as you know, I was a member of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, and this is not that I'm insecure, but it's kind of like trying to get a prom date. So the way to get on that committee is there's this call for people. We need experts in different areas, and then you can be nominated by different people. You can self-nominate, and then there's a process. So probably I was nominated, I know quite a bit about carbohydrates and fiber, but I was nominated probably 5 times before I actually was picked. So it reminds me kind of like a prom date, and then you think, what did I do wrong? Did I dress wrong, or was I in the wrong room? They need to put together a balanced committee. So it's actually really hard to do, but it's a very open process. You can nominate anyone for that. So competing interests, people said the reason you can't get on the dietary guidelines is you lay down with everybody. It's like, don't you have any standards? Like my first 5 years at Minnesota, I was 100% extension. So I went to every county in Minnesota and did a lot of work just answering consumer questions, media questions. So I do like to work with pretty much anybody that needs my expertise. So first of all, I go get research money. So I have to get research money from similar places, Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Health, TIO, Barilla, fiber companies, carbohydrate companies. What do I work in? Somebody said, what is your scope of practice? Well, hopefully if you say fiber, I will come up, but I work in a lot of different areas that have a lot to do with carbohydrates, obviously. Also plant proteins, do a lot on plant proteins, carbohydrate needs, snacking, dietary guidance, and sustainable agriculture. I'm on 3 scientific boards right now, which make no sense. People say, well, don't Simply Good Foods people hate carbohydrates? They do, and I learned a ton hanging with them about, for certain people, those are really useful diets. Sustainable Nutrition Scientific Board, based in Italy, really promotes carbohydrates and plant foods. And then Olipop is like, what? Olipop, why would you work with them? Because one of my former students asked me to be on their scientific advisory board, and I've been pushing fiber for 40 years and nobody consumes it, so really don't like pushing pop, but on the other hand, I think of meet the consumers where they are. Also, I grew up on a farm in Walworth, Wisconsin. We had 24 dairy cows, and I milked cows my whole life. I now own it, and I know how hard it is to make a living in agriculture. So the Slavin Sisters Farm, 119 acres, former dairy farm. Right now we have 72 acres of peas that are coming out in about a month. And this year I'm on sabbatical, which is great. I'm working with another one of my former students, Julie Hess, on processing up in Grand Forks. So I teach advanced human nutrition, and so therefore I say, wait a second, what do we know? How do we learn about nutrition? So we know that we are omnivores. We're closest to pigs for our digestive tract. So we can really do pretty well on a lot of different foods. So what do we find? That what's available in the food supply is really important. Protein needs are based on ideal body weight, 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight for an adult. But carbohydrates and fats really can vary depending on what's available and what you're used to in your diet. So if you go look at traditional diets, try to see how much carbohydrate or fat are in those diets. Some of the diets for people living in the Arctic, 80% of their calories come from fat. 10 to 15% need to come from protein, and then a little bit of carbohydrate. And then traditional African diets, what's their starchy foods are all they have to live on, right? So those diets can go up to 80% of their calories from carbohydrates. So the trick, how do you get in the sweet spot, is you want to make sure you have the right number of calories, adequate protein, and the essential vitamins, minerals, and fluids. And that Nutrition Today article really talks about the history of the dietary guidelines too. 1941, nutrients are key. Nutrition is trying to figure out what nutrients do we need. So 1941, we started getting the recommended dietary allowances. What are they? The quantity of nutrients a person needed to consume daily to ensure basic good health, proper growth and development, and to prevent nutrient deficiency diseases. So if you go back, nutrient deficiency diseases, if you've taken Intro to Nutrition, were problematic. Rickets, scurvy, all these things have happened because people did not have access to foods that brought these nutrients along. But in the US, really nutrient deficiency diseases have been virtually eliminated, but kind of some workarounds helped us get there. So enrichment of refined grains, fortification of dairy products with vitamin A and vitamin D. So we don't see those nutrients being deficient, but as soon as we change diets up, we can potentially see deficiencies. So nice thing is most of you guys are young. So this is thinking, wow, this is really long ago. What happened? Well, beyond deficiency diseases, all of a sudden, the dietary goals came out in 1977. And this is this idea that diet exposure affects chronic disease risk. So if you get heart disease, diabetes, all these things, diet over time is going to be a predictor of getting those things. And then we have to look at nutrition in a different way. So rather than just looking at these nutrients and chasing nutrients, we have to look at dietary patterns and what are these links with chronic disease. The underlying premise for this work, and remember this was the dietary goals, 1977, was this idea that too much fat, too much sugar or salt can be and are linked directly to heart disease, cancer, obesity, and stroke, among other killer diseases. So those are my highlighting there. But I want to point out the first thing that I probably didn't cover this very well. This was the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Health, led by Senator George McGovern, South Dakota, issued the Dietary Goals for Americans, 1977, without any input from medical or nutrition people. So when you say, hey, this is terrible right now, the government has taken over dietary recommendations, it's happened before, and it kind of is to shake things up. So and the bottom was nutrition scientists were outraged that no scientists were involved in this operation at all. They didn't get to review it, they weren't on the committee, but history has a way of repeating itself. So rather than freak out and say, hey, this is terrible that the government has taken over, they basically want to shake things up and get there. So why do we care about the dietary goals? They really led us directly to the dietary guidelines. So Janet King, a friend of mine from UC Davis, showed this slide, and I think it's really important that this is a very long journey to get from science, nutrition science, to what should I eat for dinner. It's a very long journey, but we got to make that decision every day. So we're always on that journey. Over there in the science, you have the dietary reference intakes, the RDAs, upper limits, all these things to say what kind of nutrients do we need and how can we get those nutrients. So those don't change. It's kind of settled science. If there is some new data and we say, hey, we need more calcium, we think, we need more vitamin D, a new panel of scientists are convened and they can say we should make a recommendation. This is not an overnight process. This takes years and years. So remember the RDAs, the dietary reference intakes, they're 25 years old unless some of them have been updated over time, but that's okay because things haven't changed. If there's new data, you bet we need to change them. They don't change with a stroke of a pen. That is a very deliberative process to change the RDAs because they're really important. In the middle is two things. First, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, and that is the one from that 2010 that I was on, and those are the dietary guidelines in 2010. I'm going to give you an idea. I told you I really wanted to be on the dietary guidelines, although in a lot of ways I had a bad attitude. I said nothing changes anyway, they're really stupid, who cares, but kind of I want to be on. I want to see what's going on behind the curtain. I would really like to get in. And so I finally got in, and what happens, it's a very long process for you to get into this. After that you are selected as a candidate, you have to absolutely tell them everything. You cannot have any things, any conflicts of interest. And you are kind of a special government employee, but you don't get paid, and it's just a ton of work. So for the honor, it's great, you know. I always tell this story too. In 2008, my son was in high school and he came down to the basement where I was frantically writing the protein chapter and he said, dinner? And I just looked at him and he said, okay, I'll take care of it, Mom. And then I thought, it's kind of ironic that here I am working on good nutrition, tell my kid to take a hike, because it was a ton of work to write the background. But, you know, as a scientist, that's what we do. The dietary guidelines come up. So from 2008 to 2010, we had 6 public meetings, all of this work, writing all these chapters. And then the dietary guidelines come out, Health and Human Services and USDA, 2 government agencies working together, issued the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. We never knew what they were. We never saw them before. So people would call up and say, hey, you really screwed up. This is wrong. It's like, we are just the Scientific Advisory Committee. That is our job. We advise on science. We have no role in changing the dietary guidelines. Are you kidding? We don't even see them. You know, so, and then what happens is my plate or some way of translating that into policy, right? So all these things are happening at the same time. Now, a couple of things I want to point out. This is my science side, that you can only use human data for dietary guidelines. For RDAs and other, you can use lots of scientific data to get your RDAs and things like that. You can use animal studies. Dietary guidelines are only human research. So most of that is epidemiological research, and then you can use modeling, dietary data analysis, doing that. But this idea of food pattern modeling is actually a good way. If we take something out of the diet, what happens? We don't have to do it with a bunch of humans and make them deficient. We can do it with modeling. And remember, everything's going around, right? So if there's a new finding, then potentially we can change that. Health and Human Services, USDA, use this technical report from the DGAC, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, to update the dietary guidelines. So what happens? Well, if you go back to 1980, every 5 years, not very much, because nutrition doesn't move that fast, right? So whole grains got in. I was really glad that whole grains got in. There's some recommendations for added sugar, but if you go back to the original dietary guidelines, there really hasn't been much change. And this is the one from 2020-25, 4 nutrients of concern. They come up every 5 years: calcium, vitamin D, potassium, fiber. Great for me, I'm in the fiber business, but those things don't change. So if we're making changes in the diet that are going to make those worse, that's a bad thing. Healthy pattern limits: sat, fat, 10% of calories per day. Trans fat, keep it as low as possible. Added sugar, 10% of calories per day. Sodium, 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. But you also see this shift from individual foods and ingredients to healthy eating patterns. So this is like, this is what you do as a dietitian: foods to nutrients, foods to nutrients. You're doing all this at the same time, and you got to make all those numbers work out. Now, I told you at the beginning, like every people is like, nobody cares about the dietary guidelines. Who cares? Nothing ever happens. There you see the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, which I spent 2 years of my life helping with. That informs the dietary guidelines, but it really is, that's off to the races then. It does really matter. When people say, who cares? Hey, hear me out, it really matters. Why does it matter? It affects every program in the US, right? SNAP program, WIC program, school lunch program have to follow the dietary guidelines. This is not going to happen overnight, right? When there's a whole grains change in the dietary guidelines, it takes years to get that implemented into programs. Same thing for the nutrition facts panel. It has to follow the dietary guidelines. It takes years to make that happen. So how long did it take to get trans fats on there, added sugar? It takes years and a lot of costs. Marketing, labeling. People and food companies are not the enemy. They are here to provide our food, and they can take sodium out, they can put whole grains in, they can take sugar out, and once they have a reason to believe, which is the dietary guidelines and policy, you bet, they can jump through and do that. And then all of nutrition education. What's the healthy diet? How do we tell kids? How do we tell everybody to put together a healthy diet? That's what my plate helps us. All right, so what happened? If you go back, if you read the Make America Healthy Again, some of the stuff that's in there kind of follows through. But that's why I wanted to go back to the dietary goals. Every once in a while we got to shake it up, right? Let's say since 1980, if there hasn't been that much change, let's shake it up. But if you read this, a lot of focused on ultra-processed foods. Who's the new enemy that we're going to go after? These are formulated for shelf life and or palatability, which generally most consumers would say, well, I kind of want that. That's okay. But there's too much added sugar, refined grains, unhealthy fats, sodium, and low in fiber and essential nutrients. Okay, do we need a new package of try to get to nutrition? We can discuss that once we get it figured out. And then this shift from minimally processed animal-based sources of fat such as butter and lard. This is a game changer. It's like, wait a second, those are very high in saturated fat. We're promoting those now? Okay. Fat-soluble vitamins, absolutely want to get those. There's no problem. And this idea of refined seed oils, and then we got to come up with new ways of looking at that. Why are we looking at it? How do we regulate it? And this idea of the omega-6, omega-3, and all of this, there's some science to back me up here. I could write you an article on any of these, but are we going to change all of our policy based on that? This is the big thing in MAHA. Dietary guidelines are not involved in food additives. They can use food additives, like alternative sweeteners are a solution to help us get added sugars out. But in this, if you go back to MAHA, all these things that were kind of teed up in this document, and this is pre the dietary guidelines, certain food additives are linked to increased risks of mental disorders. Wait, come on, do we have that? We don't have that. Now, that is not science. Attention deficit, ADHD, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and even carcinogenic. So all of a sudden it's like, wait, where's the data for that? And I can throw some references in there too to convince you, but remember the dietary guidelines have nothing to do with food additives. That is done by FDA and organizations there. And then all the food colors that got kicked out. And remember, none of these are all a choice, have to be on the label. So yeah, I think if consumers want to get rid of them, absolutely get rid of them. But to say that there is a clear link to disease, that was really not true. And then the alternative sweeteners, you don't have to use those, but for a lot of consumers, they really do appreciate that for getting added sugar out of their diet. And then just the advantage of whole foods. And the mental illness, teeing up mental illness is really, I think, very misleading. It's like, hey, Whole foods are going to give me lower risk of all these things, including mental illness. Well, what are whole foods? Let's define that first. So I wanted to put the thing on the bottom too, is that the DGAs have a history of being unduly influenced by corporate interests and making little distinction between industrial processed foods and home-cooked foods or whole foods if they have nutrient profiles the same. All we can do is compare nutrients, right? That is something we have to do for sure. And there was the DGA process is so open, it's so transparent, it's amazing. There are no corporations, everybody can be in the room, everybody can send in information to them, and I think that's really unfair. And as somebody that's been on the committee, it's like, that didn't happen. I'm sorry, that's not the way it is. But it's true that we have to look at nutrients because we have these 4 nutrients of concern, so we're always going to be pushing those along. All right, this is where we're going, and Eat Real Food. Released, remember what happens, usually there's a process. So the DGAC committee report comes out, the dietary guidelines will then come out, and then will we change the pyramid, will we change this? All of this happened all at the same time. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report was basically ignored. They said, we're not going to use it. And these poor people that had spent 2 years of their life putting it together, that are just good hardworking scientists that volunteered their time for this, it's too bad. Hopefully they will use some of the information in it because it's just a ton of work. And so then we get into the highly processed foods, which this engineered food-like item extracted from foods containing industrial manufactured chemical additives. It's like, that's a whole new area. And because the definition, we need first a definition of highly processed foods before we can regulate it. And some of these things, just wanted to mention, it really makes me sad, some of the quotes that are in this document: significantly reduce the consumption of highly processed refined carbohydrates, white bread, ready-to-eat or packaged breakfast options, flour tortillas, crackers. There are cultures, flour tortillas half their calories. So to tee that up is that, this is bad for you when they're trying to feed their families is really unfair. Obviously, salt, sugar, we are continuing to do that. This one, highly processed foods disrupt the gut microbiome balance. That's my gig. That's where I work, and that's really misleading, that the processing is what's going on. So I'm going to finish up on this, and where I want to go is the 1916. So USDA has been in this gig for a really long time of trying to help people eat better. Food for young children. Let's get it right for kids. Let's get it right for kids. So right from the beginning, I always tell my students, you're going to do fine. You can do horrible things and your body's already set, but for kids, we can't screw it up. So let's make sure they have access to the best food we can get to them. Then we have the basic 7 in the 40s. Amazing, because it split up vegetables. Here's starchy vegetables with a lot of calories. Here are other vegetables without calories. Eat the number of servings based on what you need. Then we pretty much have been on the basic 4, which is not bad. These are things, and those pull nutrients together. I really like 1992. I think it's the easiest, it's the most correct, because most of our calories can come from carbohydrate. They should be starchy carbohydrates. They should be culturally appropriate carbohydrates. I wish we'd never left it. It gives you this idea you don't need that much meat, you don't need that much dairy, and this idea of building your base with carbohydrates because it is the most sustainable. 2005, I like the guy running, but otherwise it didn't do anything. And then from 2011, and I insisted to write a protein chapter when I was on the Dietary Guidelines Committee. I said, come on, protein's number 1, let's get it. And so then when this came out, people were like, what the heck, why is protein on there? I had nothing to do with the plate, right? It really is, we need this protein section and what gets into the protein. The dairy makes no sense. And this is the hard thing of trying to get all these messages across in a simple way. Dairy should just be a slice of the pie. Why do I need dairy? For calcium and vitamin D. They continue to be nutrients of concern, so we can get it different ways, but it needs to go over there. So what did Canada do? They basically have the same thing, and they say, make water your drink of choice. Absolutely, water is the number 1 thing you got to get. And then I said, where's your dairy on this? And they said, hey, that's yogurt. They're like, hey guys, if I'm a consumer, that's ranch dressing. I just don't buy it. So trying to help people get the best diet they can, for sure. So some conclusions. I'm going to defend the dietary guidelines forever. It was an honor to be on it, and most people around the world say you guys are so fortunate. Maybe it doesn't have to be every 5 years, but it's currently in our regulations to do it. So The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, a group of scientists, inform the dietary guidelines. What do? We update the scientific questions and provide a summary of those findings. What's new in any of these areas that we have to update findings? Then USDA and HHS working together publish the dietary guidelines. They affect everything. I already told you that. They affect the Nutrition Facts Panel, and they give food processors and food manufacturers a reason to make commitments, which are expensive. If I'm putting things in or taking things out, all of those things are expensive. Give them a reason to go down those paths. More fiber, more whole grains, less added sugar, less saturated fat. Get rid of trans fat as best you can. So they do not regulate food additives, and they do not set the RDA for nutrients. So the RDA hasn't changed for protein. They can't do it. Now they can act like they did it, but they can't do it. It's not in their scope of practice. So maybe they can today, but they really can't if we follow any rules at all. So eat real foods, great tagline, like it myself. It's a great message, but the new dietary guidelines have deviated from accepted science into influencer science and create confusion and mistrust in nutrition science and our food system. I think for me, we got to connect with consumers. They need to put healthy, thrifty, tasty foods on their family's table, promote food prep, local foods, cultural sensitivity, enjoying eating. So appreciate talking to you people that get out the message, because I sit in my little place at the U, and when people can translate it and connect with that audience, it's really appreciated. So thank you so much.
Hi everyone, I'll reintroduce myself while Calvin gets that pulled up. I'm Grace Chamberlin. I work for the Center for Science and the Public Interest, and my job for the past 2 years has been following the process that Dr. Slavin alluded to. So we'll get right into it, and I'm gonna cover what the heck just happened is the topic of my presentation. So I'll cover the typical Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee process, that scientific review process that Dr. Slavin talked about, and then get through what actually came out in the final DGA. What do they say? How do they diverge from the scientific report and from other recommendations? And what does that mean for policy? I am a mere policy advocate. I have no relationships to disclose. As Dr. Slavin covered, for the vast majority of the history of the dietary guidelines, which started in 1980, despite what you'll hear on the internet from influencers, that dietary guidance is constantly changing. Am I supposed to eat eggs? Am I not supposed to eat eggs? Dietary guidance has really been remarkably consistent. Since 1980, we've had things in there like include a variety of fruits and vegetables and lean proteins and low-fat dairy and limit saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium. We've had the basics down for quite a long time. You kind of already know what you should be eating. And the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, that group of scientists, they really kind of carried this torch. There was nothing incredibly radical, but I've bolded, this is a summary of their recommendations from the scientific report that they put together to inform the 2025 guidelines. And those bolded parts are what I would say are new from the 2020 guidelines. So they said, yes, fruits, yes, vegetables, yes, protein, same, but let's really lean in on whole fruits. Let's really lean in on plant-based proteins as a subset of those proteins. And when we're talking about grains, let's really say mostly whole grains instead of a mix of refined carbohydrates and whole grains. And they really said, let's limit red and processed meat. There are clear indicators of that being linked to negative health outcomes. You don't have to eradicate it entirely, but let's up the plant-based proteins and let's decrease the red and processed meat. Still limit those things we want to limit, and they did a review on ultra-processed foods, but were not able to come to strong conclusions because of the state that ultra-processed food research is in. We don't have a clear definition. There are different research methods. It's a little bit of a mess, and so they evaluated said mess, and they said, we need more research. There isn't clear evidence on what we should do about ultra-processed foods, and they were not asked to review alcohol. Alcohol could be a whole other hour-long presentation. They weren't asked to review it. They said, just look at these 2 other reports that are ongoing. I'm happy to talk about it more later if you have questions. And they followed this process. The process that Dr. Slavin was a part of in 2010 has been iterated and improved upon every single time that it happens. But the most important takeaway that I want you to have is that it is incredibly rigorous and incredibly transparent. So this group of 20 independent independent nutrition scientists called the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. All of their decisions are made as a consensus. And when I say decisions, I mean they are going through these 3 different processes on this side. And they are doing data analysis, they're doing food pattern modeling for those things that we can't see in human trials, like Dr. Slavin talked about, and they're doing systematic reviews, so very rigorous, publicly posted protocols, and most of the process is public. When the questions that they review are published, you and I can comment on them and ask questions and say, why aren't we looking at this? And they incorporate that feedback. When the DGAC is nominated, that is a public process, and who they nominate and their collective conflicts of interest this time were disclosed. That is open to the public. Their protocols are posted for public input, and then all of their preliminary findings are publicly disclosed at 6, in this time there were 7, public meetings. And then their final scientific report is open to public comment before it becomes the final dietary guidelines for Americans. The only part that isn't open to public comment and those transparent and rigorous kind of like pre-published records is when USDA and HHS take back over and start developing the DGA from this scientific report. One thing that was new in this DGAC that I do want to talk about is they really worked to incorporate a health equity lens. This was a directive from the Biden administration. And when I say that they incorporated health equity lens, what I mean is just that they double checked their work. So they, for example, found that certain dietary patterns were healthier for cardiovascular disease outcomes, reducing red meat, increasing fiber and plant-based proteins, et cetera. And then they said, let's make sure that that's true for the full diversity of populations that exists in the United States. So they did reanalyzed a subset of research articles that had a stronger proportion of certain subpopulations, and they said, yes, okay, what we are recommending to the general public is actually generalizable to the general public, and we can continue to recommend that for all populations. They also did a pilot for the first time on traditional foods that are relevant to American Indian and Alaska Native populations to make sure that, again, the recommendations that we're giving in the dietary guidelines are actually relevant to the full breadth of people that live in this country. So can different subgroups use their culturally relevant foods as kind of sub-ins for what the dietary guidelines would typically give as food examples and still meet all their nutrient needs? The answer was yes, absolutely, but we just wanted to double check. That's what it means to incorporate a health equity lens. And that is really important because any action that makes the dietary guidelines for Americans more accessible is critical because we are not good at following the dietary guidelines. This 56 out of 100, if you got a 56 on your test in school, are you happy? No, that is a failing grade. So that is our grade on our alignment with the dietary guidelines as a country. A higher score indicates higher adherence with the dietary guidelines for Americans. And you see, we do a little better when basically someone else is taking care of us. When we're a baby and when we're an older adult, our alignment is a little stronger. But overall, when we're in charge of our own diets, we are not necessarily eating a variety of fruits and vegetables and lean proteins and whole grains and limiting our saturated fat to less than 10%. And so anything that makes those dietary guidelines more accessible, more readable, more culturally relevant is a great move. And that's what they were trying to do with that health equity lens. This is the 101 process. So as Dr. Slavin mentioned, that DGA is typically informed by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's independent report. That's been a part of the process since 1980. So what happened? To cut to the meat of my, that was not intended, to cut to the meat of my presentation, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory recommendations were largely not included in the final DGA. I've now bolded and highlighted in red everything that was not incorporated, and in fact, in many cases, was directly contradicted in the final DGA. So for example, the DGAC, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, said increase your proportion of plant-based proteins and reduce red meat. And you may already know what the final DGA says instead. Things like whole grains are actually read not necessarily because they went in the wrong direction, but just because it was really different. So the final DGA ultimately said all whole grains, no refined carbohydrates, all of it should be whole grains. That's not necessarily the opposite of what the DGAC recommended, it's just different from what they said in their report. Ultimately, the administration, when it got into the hands of USDA and HHS as a part of that normal process, rejected 75% of the DGAC's report. This is from the Scientific Foundation, which is the new scientific basis that they created to inform their dietary guidelines. So these numbers are their math. This is not me digging through and deciding on my own. USDA and HHS published this chart in their document and said that they flat out said no entirely to 54% of the DGAC's recommendations, and then they partially incorporated 21% of the DGAC's recommendations. Why? Why did we depart so drastically from the typical process? Well, they had a reason. They said that the central concern with the DGAC report was that all scientific questions were evaluated through a health equity lens. And that reverses the proper sequence of scientific inquiry. This is from the Scientific Foundation, this new document that I mentioned that they created to inform the dietary guidelines for Americans. So they basically said, we're scrapping the DGAC process that took 2 years, 20 people, all of those rigorous reviews, all of those publicly posted protocols. That is invalid because they used a health equity lens. We're going to create our own scientific document. It's called the Scientific Foundation. And within that Scientific Foundation is this explanation for why it exists. They said the Scientific Foundation was needed as an evidentiary foundation for the 2025 DGA because the American public deserves dietary guidance that is free from ideological bias, institutional conflicts, or predetermined conclusions. I want to say right now, I agree. And I think my organization, Center for Science and Public Interest, agrees. I think you all probably agree. Journalism free from ideological bias and institutional conflicts is probably something you strive for. It is also what we strive for in creating the DGA. So what did that mean? Free from ideological bias. Can anyone think of someone high up, perhaps in Department of Health and Human Services, who might have an ideological bias towards a certain dietary pattern, like maybe one high in red meat or certain other foods? It's just a hypothetical question, but I think that there are certain ideological biases that are okay. I have a bias towards plant-based foods. I'm not a full vegetarian. I have a bias towards Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I have a lot of ideological biases. The point is that I, as one individual, am not determining your dietary guidelines for Americans. So ideological bias is okay as long as we have these checks and balances in place, like a 20-person scientific committee of independent scientists who are following publicly posted protocols and review cycles. Instead, we said no to that group, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy, and the Secretary of USDA, Brooke Rollins, appointed this group of 9 reviewers to create their scientific foundation. So they did entirely new scientific reviews. These are their names, again, publicly disclosed, and they publicly disclosed all of their individual conflicts of interest. They said that, for example, some of their reviewers have financial relationships with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the National Pork Board, the National Dairy Council, and multiple members are founding co-founders or owners of high-protein supplement companies. And again, nutrition research is underfunded. That can be okay as long as it is managed well. And they are making, for example, consensus decisions. If all 9 of these people were kind of getting together and canceling each other out, that might be not as much of a concern. But if just one of them is making decisions, then that's a problem. So what was happening? Well, this is an example of what conflicts of interest can look like. This is one of the companies that's owned by one of those reviewers, and they now proudly proclaim on their website, where you can buy their products for their profit, that the dietary guidelines, they align with the dietary guidelines, which is probably not surprising. And when I said, like, okay, that's not as much of a problem as long as more than 1 or 2 people is making those final decisions in the green, I'm not going to bother with lefts and rights. In the green, we have what a review for the DGAC looks like, the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. There are 22 authors on that document who all have different conflicts of interest and ideological biases, and in doing that, they all cancel out. They have to make these group consensus decisions. They use that publicly posted protocol mechanism that I talked about. For the Scientific Foundation, you have max 3 authors. all with relevant conflicts of interest. So for example, the protein chapter was written by people with conflicts of interest with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association or the Pork Council. And when you only have sometimes one author, that's not a systematic review, that is a college thesis. That is one person's thoughts on the matter, and that is what is informing our dietary guidelines today. Now getting to predetermined conclusions. Sorry it took so long to cover institutional conflicts. This edition, they say this in the Scientific Foundation, is organized around a simple principle, that minimally processed, naturally nutrient-dense foods are the reference point for dietary guidance, and strong causal evidence is needed before recommending foods or ingredients that are highly processed. I don't necessarily disagree with this statement, I'm just noting that it is a predetermined conclusion. At the top of their report, they literally say, hey, we've decided that all minimally processed foods are good and all highly processed foods are bad, and if you want to claim that a highly processed food is good, you need to show us randomized controlled trials with mortality endpoints, the highest possible evidence rating in science, in order for us to change our minds. So again, most minimally processed foods, this sentence is probably largely fine, but it is a predetermined conclusion, which apparently they did not want in the dietary guidelines. One that I take more issue with is that before the dietary guidelines even came out, USDA released a white paper in October of 2025, so months before the final DGA came out, explicitly stating that they would use the dietary guidelines to encourage protein as the foundation for every meal. This is in a chapter of this white paper from USDA on increasing demand for the beef industry. And this is the dietary guidelines. So what changed? As you can see, we have our new upside-down food pyramid. They said they fixed the food pyramid. We got rid of the food pyramid in 2011, so they brought back the food pyramid in order to fix it and flip it. And it emphasizes protein and healthy fats. You see steak, you see whole milk, you see yogurt, you see minced beef or chopped beef, you see an entire chicken. And my main issue, kind of ignoring the content of the foods in there, is there's no clear portion recommendations in this visual. So we got feedback, you can have nitty-gritty feedback on my plate, absolutely, about what the proportions are. But you look at my plate and you understand that it's a plate and loosely what you're supposed to have on your plate. You look at this new food pyramid, and am I supposed to eat an entire rotisserie chicken and an entire wedge of cheese and an entire bottle of whole milk and a whole thing of yogurt and an egg and a whole hunk of salmon? It's unclear to the average American reader what they are supposed to eat from this food pyramid, other than that, okay, red meat is back on the menu. And then when you get down into the nitty-gritty, these are in an entirely different document. So the dietary guidelines themselves don't have that much detail on how much of these foods exactly you're supposed to eat. But they do have a different document with these details on cups of this, ounces of this. And the major changes I want to call out is we did have a massive increase in the protein recommendation. They basically recommended doubling your protein, which again, as Dr. Slavin mentioned, is not really within the purview of the dietary guidelines. That is done by an entirely different committee that has a different review underway. And then again, they changed to reduce a number of refined grains that are recommended, and they reduced, or not reduced the alcohol limit, but it just says consume less as opposed to a clear quantitative limit. And another thing that happened is we lost all of our subcategories. So it used to say, eat a certain amount of meat, but also a certain amount of seafood and nuts and seeds. And within vegetables, don't eat all carrots, eat a variety, eat spinach, eat red bell peppers, eat broccoli. And now we have no recommendations within those categories. We completely lost those sub-varieties. And so realistically, you could eat 4 servings of red meat and 3 servings of potatoes and say that your diet aligns with the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And while that's just kind of a joke for you or me, where it really matters is with the programs that align with the DGA. So 30 million students eat meals aligned with the DGA every single day in schools through the National School Lunch Program, 6 million participants in WIC, and which serves women and infants in the United States, and that includes an estimated 41% of all infants. So almost half of all babies in our country are eating diets aligned with the DGA. So when we say that the DGA matters, this is why. It touches so many people, many of whom don't have another option. This is the food that they are going to be eating. And so drastically increasing red meat or protein or changing from low-fat to full-fat dairy, we're going to see the impacts of the decisions play out on a population scale, particularly for some of our most vulnerable populations. So that is why we should care. And I'm going to pass it to Alice.
So I'm going to just offer a few comments on covering these guidelines as a journalist. And I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about my background because maybe it's a little different. I actually started out in science. I got a PhD in nutrition science and did a postdoc in physiology, and I taught college nutrition courses. So I taught students about the dietary guidelines for years. And then I pivoted, I guess about a decade ago, to health and science journalism. I initially tried to avoid writing about nutrition. I think it's a very challenging area to cover as a journalist. Food is really personal. We all bring kind of our values and beliefs about diet to the table. We have industry influence on our food industries and our food policies. And there's so many politics around food, right? So all of those things come to play in reporting on the dietary guidelines. I obviously have come to embrace the challenge of writing about nutrition, and it's really my main beat now. But I think it comes with a lot of challenges. And so that is what I'm going to start my talk on, is just the fact that nutrition science is really complicated, I think deceptively complicated, and our audiences are really bombarded with a ton of conflicting nutrition information. They're literally swimming in it if they're on social media, listening to podcasts, browsing the diet book section of the bookstore or the library. They're getting a lot of information that will include scientific references, often kind of cherry-picked science to support given hypotheses. We have scientific and medical organizations putting out recommendations, like the American Heart Association. We have our federal guidelines. Historically, those two sources of information have been relatively aligned, so that's been really helpful. If you're writing about nutrition as a journalist, you can kind of refer to these authoritative recommendations that represent the scientific consensus. I think, you know from Dr. Slavin and Grace's presentations that now these two sources of recommendations are not aligned. So that makes things further complicated. And of course, trust, consumer trust in these institutions like the American Heart Association and the federal dietary guidelines are declining. We also know that from survey data. So we're health reporters. We're really tasked with helping our audience make sense of this very conflicted landscape of information. And nutrition science is super important. We know, I think Secretary Kennedy is absolutely correct that we are in the midst of a chronic disease crisis in this country. This is probably a low estimate, but poor diets are thought to cause about 500,000 or more deaths per year in the United States. And trying to tease out what it is about our diet that is so detrimental to our health, and trying to give people evidence-based guidance on how they can improve their diets is difficult because every food has thousands of chemical molecules in it, and then we combine all of these different foods into our various diets, and everyone's diet is some selection of these different foods in combination. It's very hard to kind of quantify what a healthy diet is and come out with recommendations. And in a perfect world, you have probably seen this hierarchy of evidence. In a perfect world, we would be operating at the top of that pyramid with gold standard randomized controlled trials like we're able to do for vaccines and pharmaceuticals. But diet is so complicated, and we're often interested in chronic disease outcomes like development of cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes or cancer. Those diseases take decades to develop, so we really can't do RCTs on on diet and these long-term outcomes. So we end up having to kind of triangulate evidence using a lot of observational data, maybe some short-term randomized controlled trials, maybe looking at some mechanistic data to kind of come as close to the truth as we can. And one of the things that you find if you report on nutrition is that you end up with this evidence base that is pretty difficult to sift through. You do find different scientists interpret that evidence base differently. And so we do really depend on a consensus process to bring a group of scientists together to help us parse that data. They bring their different areas of expertise to the table. They look at data systematically, and they kind of figure out what they can agree on. And that process has worked pretty well when it comes to the dietary guidelines in the past. I do want to touch on conflicts of interest a bit more, because I think this is a really critical part of being a journalist, of course. We follow the money, that's part of our job. Conflicts of interest are really common in nutrition science, I think more than a lot of other sciences. That I think can be traced back to, federal funding for nutrition is really limited, less than 5% of the NIH budget. I think it's probably quite a bit lower than that. It's hard to estimate because nutrition science is kind of spread across different divisions of the NIH. But that estimate comes from this 2019 article in Politico by Catherine Boudreau and Helena Bodemiller-Evich. I think this is required reading for anyone reporting on nutrition today because it's still very relevant. These conflicts really matter. I probably don't have to tell anyone in this room this, but this is a brand new review that just came out a few weeks ago looking at meat industry affiliation with study conclusions, and they found that when studies on meat were industry funded, they were 16 times more likely to report favorable outcomes for meat. So it does really matter to look at where the study funding comes from. And, when you're looking at sources, at experts seeking their input as sources or looking at what they contribute to something like guidelines, I think looking at that funding is really important. So there is a long history of concern about industry influence in the dietary guidelines. And when I first started reporting on this edition of the dietary guidelines in 2023, I was thinking about two main areas, where industry influence could affect the guidelines that we end up with. First of all, are there conflicts of interest on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee? That group of scientists that were gathered, do we see a lot of conflicts among them, and were they bringing some kind of bias to that process of reviewing the science? And then second of all, in the time period after the committee turns in their report with their recommendations and HHS and USDA are writing the guidelines, that has always been kind of thought of as a black box. When we know that industry groups are lobbying those agencies because they really want the most favorable outcomes for their product, whether it's wheat or soybeans or beef or dairy, they're trying to get favorable language in the guidelines for their industry. So I was watching those two areas. The piece that I wrote in 2023 about the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, it seems very quaint now because that committee actually had relatively few conflicts of interest, and they were pretty minor ones, like small amounts of money compared to their kind of portfolio of funding, and they were very balanced across different industries. And then I really watched this process because, as Grace said, it's a very transparent process. The committee comes together and they write protocols for their systematic reviews, and they publish those, and they discuss those, and they do these systematic reviews of the science, and then they come to these public meetings where any of us could log on and watch them, and they discuss their results, and when they disagree about conclusions, they kind of hash it out in the room, and you can really see how they work and where the science comes from that informs their final conclusions. And of course, so I was watching, what is the difference between the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's report, their recommendations, and what ultimately came out in the new dietary guidelines. And you've already heard that most of their report was dismissed. We had this new group of scientific reviewers that were brought in to do additional scientific reviews to inform the final dietary guidelines. Kennedy talked about this really early on after he was confirmed, that he was worried about conflicts of interest on the dietary guidelines. He said he'd toss out, the former committee, and the panel that wrote the dietary guidelines would ultimately have no conflicts of interest. We know that turned out not to be true. STAT had great reporting on this right when the guidelines came out. It was very clear that that group of 9 scientists had strong financial ties to the beef and dairy industries. And again, we also have, I guess what I'm saying in this slide is that there were new sources of conflicts of interest or industry influence that kind of were thrown into this process in the 2025 dietary guidelines that I think were not so evident in previous cycles. Where it really felt like we weren't, the intention, the process that they undertook was not designed to bring us to scientific consensus. It very much appeared to be designed to bring us to certain conclusions, which aligned with the way I think Secretary Kennedy talks about diet and health. So I won't spend a lot of time here, because Grace covered this really well, but when I look at just kind of the very clear recommendations in the new dietary guidelines, and I just kind of sort them into, this is basically, similar to what you hear, what you see in other recommendations or you see in other dietary guidelines. These on the left align with consensus, these on the right do not align with consensus. We don't see these recommendations coming from other scientific groups or other national dietary guidelines. So there's really a theme here. There's this emphasis on higher protein diets, an emphasis on animal over plant proteins, promotion of full-fat dairy. You see it in some dietary guidelines. They don't necessarily distinguish or recommend low-fat dairy. But in these new dietary guidelines, we're really seeing a promotion of full-fat dairy as a healthy choice. And then they include butter and beef tallow as healthy fats and omit seed oils altogether from their recommendations on fats. And there's that's just strange because plant-based oils are good sources of essential fatty acids, and they generally are associated with better health outcomes. There's really not data to support avoiding them. And when you look at the new dietary guidelines and compare those guidelines with the recommendations from the American Heart Association, these just came out a few months ago, and just look at guidelines from other countries that undertake a similar process of putting together a committee of scientists to determine what their recommendations will be, you again see these specific areas where the science just doesn't align. So the shift from, the American Heart Association, the Canadian guidelines, I just chose the Netherlands because Kennedy really loves the Netherlands vaccine policies. But if you look at their dietary guidelines, they're very clear about recommending less meat, more plant-based foods, vary the diet, switch between fish, pulses, nuts, eggs, and vegetarian products. They don't encourage a lot of red meat, and they recommend plant oils, liquid plant oils over hard fats like butter and beef tallow, which I really love butter, and I eat plenty of it, but I'm not under any illusion that it's like a healthy fat, which it's currently listed as a healthy fat in the new guidelines. So, we end up basically with this set of guidelines that, if we're thinking about how they affect food policy, and I really think this is where I'll wrap up, because I think as reporters, our next step is, okay, we understand where these guidelines came from. We understand there are some areas where they align with the science or they're pretty consistent with other recommendations. And if those are the parts of the guidelines that we see affecting our federal food policy, that could move us in the right direction. But if we see, if we see more continued push for protein and more animal products, there's really no evidence that that is going to be the thing that makes Americans healthier. And it's a little bit, baffling when you look at the scientific consensus and you look at recommendations from other countries, and we ended up with these guidelines that I think like the things that we're seeing really pushed from those guidelines are probably not the areas that could really turn things around for us in the United States. So I will wrap up there, and we will move on to take some questions.
Hi, Meryl Davids-Landau, freelance journalist. I have two questions. So you talked about the low adherence to the dietary guidelines. Is the thinking among nutritionists that it's the low adherence that connects to Americans' poor diets and poor health outcomes related to diets? Or is there thinking that there's still some disconnect between what the guidelines are intended to focus on and what is needed for people to be more disease-free in this country? And then just a second question, if anybody knows, the Nutrition for Precision Health study from the All of Us thing, is that still ongoing, or was that killed by this administration? So if you know anything about where that stands, that would be great.
Great question. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. I'll just touch on the first one, which is that I think that we have a few barriers to beneficial health outcomes related to diet in this country. And in my opinion, and I think my organization's thinking is access is the biggest one. I think that if people were able to consistently access the diet that is being recommended, we would see a lot better health outcomes. And in that sense, I guess, yes, that does mean that if people could follow the DGA and had the resources to and the time to, then I do think that would have a big impact on health outcomes. The thing about nutrition science is it's always evolving. Maybe one day we will have clearer science that this one additive is what's single-handedly causing obesity. I don't think it's ever that obvious. So I think if we could get 90% alignment with the DGA based on massive changes to our food system as a whole, I think we should start there. That's a pretty obvious starting point to improve health outcomes. And maybe there will be a different silver bullet one day, but I think access and adherence are the two biggest factors in my mind.
Do you know anything about the precision health? Okay. Yeah, I don't know. So I have not seen anything about the precision health study being cut. I think it's still ongoing. It's a huge study. And in fact, in the second MAHA report, there's some language about increasing funding for precision nutrition. I have not seen any increase in any funding for nutrition research, but it seemed like that was kind of called out as an area of interest. That's kind of controversial among scientists, though, like how far that kind of precision approach will really get us, because a lot of people come back to the access issue as kind of the big one that we should probably address.
I want to just point out, I appreciate that question. Right now, we're kind of in chaos as far as research funding. And as it's talked about, nutrition science has never been funded very well at all. And then so if you look right now, a lot of the things that we really need, like NHANES goes through the CDC, and a lot of the people that have traditionally followed nutrition information and provided nutrition information are kind of unclear. Their jobs have been gone or their funding's been gone. So at the U, some of our problems, a lot of the federal funding we have, it's either on hold or and I think this is the sad thing about that. It's the same problem for school lunch, and everybody's like, did these changes happen overnight? Do we have to comply and get whole milk into school lunch tomorrow, which we can't do because there's contracts. So I think that's the frustrating thing, and that's where I kind have netted on, let's, because as we've heard from Grace and others here, they haven't really changed. You know, it's some of these things that we get really upset about and say, hey, do we need to eat more red meat? It's not consistent. We have no data that we need more protein. We have no data that we need more red meat. So that, I think that's the frustration, is that everybody's in this confusion. And generally it takes probably 2 to 3 years to get these through a process, number of servings you have to have, and all of a sudden there's no servings, and how do people implement it? So I think that's, that's why I always start with the dietary goals too, that we've had these big stressors about, because just the idea that, is it secretive, or the dietary guidelines controlled by people that hate red meat, is like, you know, let's get that out there and we can kind of move on. So, but a lot of the people that are involved in long-term research, a lot of this epi research where the Nurses Health Study, we want to cover people and follow them for 20 years, it's really expensive research. And so all of a sudden, if that funding isn't there, or they're holding the funding and the people that are working on the projects aren't getting paid, that's the sad part right now as far as research across the board.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Fink, an independent journalist. As a freelancer, frequently get assigned random, consumer health stories, what to eat for this, what to eat for that. It's never been simple, but we used to be able to reliably refer to the guidelines. And so we just talked about the disconnect, and Dr. Slavin, you just said there's no data that shows we need more protein, more red meat. And this is what the guidelines say right now. And there's this deep story behind it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we as journalists can write scientifically accurate, useful consumer information while navigating this is what the guidelines are, without including, these whole paragraphs about these conflicts of interest that perhaps went into the process.
That is such a good question, and I'm glad you asked it. And I grapple with the same thing. I write a lot of service journalism as well. I think it's the same question that you're grappling with if you write about vaccines. Are you going to refer your readers to the CDC website? Probably, so it's really unfortunate. I think even if we just referred to federal guidance without any caveats, our readers, are they going to trust that? So I just, I think for me personally, this is just my opinion. I don't think that I will be referring to this set of dietary guidelines as my kind of go-to if I need I need a comparison point to, explain to someone how much sugar is considered too much added sugar, for example, or how much protein do you really need? I think for protein, I would refer to the RDA. It still exists. It's still the 0.8 grams per kilogram, and that's kind of the scientific standard that was determined by consensus. Dr. Slavin was involved in a systematic review that came out just before, that was funded by AHRQ, right? That came out in 2024 and 2025, I think, just before these guidelines, to look at the protein requirement. A big group of scientists got together and did a systematic review, and their conclusion was there's not enough evidence to increase the protein requirement. So I think it's it depends on the topic. You're going to maybe have to dig deeper and look for those systematic reviews that probably represent consensus better than these guidelines. I really appreciate, I think the American Heart Association's guidance that just came out is really solid. It's very easy to understand, and they've really put a lot of thought into those recommendations, so I'll probably be leaning more towards that. But it's a hard question. Yeah, and I'm very curious to see how this evolves in the next guidelines, and whether, are people just going to kind of throw up their hands? And if the federal guidance changes drastically depending on who the health secretary or the ag secretary are, I think it's going to ultimately compromise trust in this document, which is it is really important, and I've referred to it plenty of times as a good source of just consensus in nutrition science. So
So
That's a good
I'm going to
question.
follow up on the protein side. To me, if you look at the acceptable macronutrient distribution range for protein, it's 10 to 35% of your calories. And it's like, well, why would it be that? Because if you're on a really low calorie diet to get to 0.8 grams of protein, you might need 35% of your calories from protein. And that's what's really hard to translate into consumers. Protein is not a nutrient of concern in the U.S. The average person gets enough, but we want to make sure it's an expensive thing, and we want to make sure that everybody can get it. So I love protein. It's the most important nutrient. We got to get it. It's expensive. So I just think that it's like, it's still 0.8. It can't change, even though people talk about it all the time. The other thing I do want to point out too, if you look at the dietary guidelines and consumers' interest in them, people have heard about these and they care, and before they didn't. So I kind of like to pick up some good pieces of what's good about it. All of a sudden people are like, oh, we have these dietary guidelines and I've heard about them. Now a lot of the stuff is wrong, so to try to moderate that, you guys want to get good information out, but kind of to pick, obviously real food, we want that, but for consumers, access, price, the school lunch people, there's no way they can double the protein for what they get to put a lunch on the table. They can't get away from ultra-processed foods. They don't have people, they don't have preparation. So, but it's like an aspirational goal, it's okay. But I think that to go out and say, hey, I'm going to talk about these new protein recommendations, I wouldn't go there, but protein really important. So kind of pick up the things, but I agree, I've got to talk about conflict of interest too, because everybody in nutrition that's out there doing research is probably going to take some research money from a commodity group or a company. In fiber and whole grains, most of the research funding has come that way. So that's hard to say, will I ever get a quote from somebody that took money from beef? Well, in the protein world, most of the protein experts have taken money from beef. So the conflict of interest is also really hard for you guys to get through. But still, obviously, they broke every rule for this shadow Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. And I really appreciate you guys digging that out and putting it out there, because most of us, I didn't know that, because it's not that important. A lot of this stuff, do consumers really want to know how to do a systematic review? They don't, so we got to translate and help them and make them feel like they're, I got 2 grandkids that every time I'm like, hey, some of the information they have is wrong, so this, I'm going to avoid this, and they shouldn't have dairy because of, and it's like, wait a second. So appreciating where they live and their culture and being respectful. And I think some of that, to me, is very sad where we're at.
A few other just concrete resources that I find helpful, because we do the same. CSPI has a magazine called Nutrition Action. So our science writers are in the same boat as you all and dealing with this mess. And a few resources we really love are, yes, the American Heart Association guidance. The World Health Organization has dietary guidelines that are very science-based and a great resource. If you're looking for a specific topic, Healthy Eating Research is an organization that has really great, if you're specific, like, oh, if my kid can't have dairy milk, what are the most nutritious non-dairy milks? That's a document that they have. So those are some great resources. And then I do think I'm obligated to plug, CSPI created our own uncompromised dietary guidelines for Americans. And before you think that that's fully biased by CSPI's, all we did was actually take the 2025 DGAC's recommendations and update the 2020 DGA. So in summary, we just did what USDA and HHS were supposed to do or should have done. We took the 2020 DGA, we inserted the new guidance from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee scientific report. You're welcome to use that as a resource. It's the uncompromised DGA, and you can find it on our website. And in that, I think my last recommendation is just the 2025 DGAC report. That's still available. It's long, so you might want to find a summary of it, but that is still a really updated consensus on the nutrition science on a lot of these topics.
We'll take one more question, and then I think we need to wrap it up.
Hi, I'm Claire. I'm an independent journalist, and I have sort of a micronutrient question. I know a part of the conversation with ultra-processed foods is you might have, say, a processed cereal that's fortified with certain micronutrients. We also know that whole grains are rich in micronutrients. Of course, access to those two things might be really different depending on where you live or who you are. Does the DGA have any sort of role to play in pushing our food systems generally towards a more, say, regenerative or localized food system? I know that that's like a broad conversation, but wondering if there's, a role for DGA in that process.
I'm going to just, being on the committee back in 2008, we were trying to come up with definitions for minimally processed foods. So it's not a new thing. What has happened, I think, as far as processing, everything that we do, whether it's dairy, meat, grains, fruits, and vegetables, have different processing steps. Most of it's for safety, some of it's for, just food stability. So I think that it's always been a topic, but it generally hasn't been this idea of, does it affect a health outcome? And most of the questions you're asking for dietary guidelines is exposure to something, how does that affect a health outcome? So I think it's always, and because, people are like, well, it's USDA, don't they care about agriculture and bringing people in with an agricultural background? But typically to get that expertise, and that's, I really felt honored growing up on a farm and understanding a little more about agriculture, that, these agriculture, like you talk about wheat, all these people that have an interest, but they don't understand the whole thing. So I think they've tried hard, but to me, this is the good thing about processing. Let's push it on and make sure it's appropriate, because we want the closest to local. Everybody needs to enjoy their food, right? So the more linked they are to the food, we're all going to be better off.
So far as regenerative agriculture sustainability, it depends who you ask whether the DGA should have a role in that. It's been a battle for about a decade. In 2015, the DGAC did make recommendations to align the DGA recommended diet with a sustainable diet. So they had a whole analysis showing that a diet that's healthy can also be more sustainable. And they wanted that to be incorporated into the DGA. That was shut down at the congressional level. And every cycle since, there's been kind of a battle about whether or not we should integrate sustainability. I think that the cat's out of the bag, that the food system and climate change are deeply intertwined, and my opinion is it only makes sense that the guidance we're giving to folks helps also make sure that we have a safe food system and an effective food system for a long time to come. And there are organizations that are working on that. We also put out something called a model for healthy and sustainable dietary guidelines. But there are a piece of legislation right now actively trying to prevent that from ever happening. So right now in the Farm Bill, there's language that would prevent the DGA from covering a lot of really important topics, including agricultural production practices, but also including race, culture, ethnicity, et cetera. So I don't know what your opinion is, but if you do want the DGA to be able to consider a broader amount of topics, you might want to look into the House Farm Bill language on the Dietary Guidelines and the Dietary Guidelines Reform Act, and question whether that should come into play.
That's definitely an area to follow in our reporting, because, these guidelines will continue to evolve and be under pressure and restrictions from all sides. So we will see what happens. But thank you all. I think we need to wrap up and let you go. Thanks for your attention. And we're probably all happy to chat a little bit more afterwards. But we'll see you all out at the conference.